All right, here we are. The Bible, how we got it, and why we can trust it. And first off, any questions from what we've covered so far? No? All right, well, we've been going through the Bible. We've pretty much finished how we got it. We went through the transmission of the text, the translations, all that fun stuff. We're now talking about the reliability. We know the Bible we have is what was written by the apostles and prophets, and that has come down to us, and we don't have to worry about all these myths about it being changed or edited or things like that. We know those are false because the evidence shows that they're false. But that still leaves the question of, we may have what they wrote, but is what they wrote true? Is it accurate? And so we've been looking at the reliability, and the first part of that was the internal reliability. And now we're looking at the external reliability. And last time we looked at archaeology, and we showed that why we can't prove the Bible, we can't expect to find a bill of sale for Joseph, that the details described in the Bible line up very, very well, and in fact line up in a way that shows that the critics of the Bible are false. They would require them to know conditions 1,000 years before they were writing, when even we didn't know them until we did the detailed archaeological work. So, but this week we're going to start going into a little bit more broader topic of science in the Bible. And how do we correspond our 21st century understanding of science with a document written thousands of years ago, before we knew about Newton's laws or Kepler's laws of planetary motion or gravity or any of the things, or Einstein or quantum mechanics? How do we reconcile those two? And like we saw in archaeology, a large part of it's going to be, how do you approach the subject? What kind of questions do you ask? So, first off, are there clear scientific errors in the Bible? Well, if you want to be strictly literal, yes, there are. Take a look at 2 Samuel 23:4. 2 Samuel 23:4, talking about God. He is the light of the morning at sunrise, on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings the grass from the earth. Well, we know the sun doesn't actually rise, right? We know the earth is actually spinning on its axis. So is this an error in the Bible? Well, if you want to be really hyper-technical, yes it is. But on the other hand, do we still speak of sunrise?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, we do. Is the morning news, when it says sunrise will be at 6:23, in error? Well, if you want to be strictly scientifically literal, yes. But on the other hand, we all know what it means. It means the time the sun comes up. Now, it would have been possible, through the inspiration of God, for the author of Samuel to write something along the lines of, he is like the morning, he's like the light of the morning at the time that the movement of the sun rises above the horizon due to the rotation of the earth. But would that have really made any sense? And in fact, what would it have actually meant to someone reading Samuel in the time it was written?
Absolutely nothing.
Or 500 years, or 1,000 years after that, or at the time of Jesus, or in the Middle Ages? It would have meant nothing to them. So one of the things we have to realize is that when we come to the Bible, it's not a textbook of science. it's communicating the message of God. And it's communicating it in a way that the people who hear it can understand it. And so, yeah, it could be said it's technically an error when it talks about sunrise, because we know from our science classes that the sun doesn't really rise. It only appears to rise. But that's the way the Bible describes things. It's not attempting to set forth a scientific, accurate explanation. And in this case, it's attempting to describe the glory of God. And if you think about this really clear, beautiful morning where the sun's just coming up over the horizon, you've probably all experienced mornings like that, and they sort of take your breath away, and they're just gorgeous. And you just want to stop and take it in for a while. That's what this verse is talking about. It's not talking about celestial mechanics and the movement of the planets around the stars. Let's take a look at another supposed error this time. Go to 1 Kings, chapter 7.
Are these verses that skeptics have pointed to?
I have heard the sunrise. I was actually in another verse, but when I did the research on the other verse, it turns out that that one is not really even talking about sunrise, so I moved to this one. This one is an actual error. If you Google this online, you will find skeptics. I've had debates with skeptics over this one, and they are insistent that this is a clear scientific error in the Bible. And we'll talk about the potential error, and we'll talk about why it's actually not an error, if you want to be hyper-scientific about it. So let's take a look at 1 Kings 7:23. He made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. So they're talking about the bowl, the huge bowl that sits outside the temple, right? And we know from the dimensions given here that what was the diameter?
30. Was it 30 cubits around?
Circumference is 30 cubits. Basically, if you work out the math, what do you get for a value of pi?
3.
3. And what is pi?
3.14.
There, we got an error. Because we know pi is 3.14159 whatever, and on and on and on and on. But here it says it's, if you do the math, it says it's 3. Is that an error? Well, it's not 3, is it? So in some respects, it's an error. Except, if you want to get really, really scientifically accurate, whenever you start doing math, so we get 30 divided by 10 equals 3. Right? And they're saying pi is actually, which is equal to pi, which is 3.1415. So clearly we have an error here. Except if you're going to get really precise in terms of science, you may have remembered from your science classes they have a concept of significant digits. And when you do significant digits, basically means your precision coming out of the equation cannot be better than the precision coming in. And you've all seen this was really obvious when people first got calculators, because you do a calculation in calculator and it gives you these, 0.15723648776. Now you just divide two numbers, and you know that last digit isn't accurate, is it? How could it be? So when you look at this gets to be the tricky part. How many significant digits do we have here? We have one. Think about it. When someone says there are 1,000 people there, are they saying there was not 999? In fact, if you say there were 10 people there, are you saying there wasn't 9? Or really could not have been 11? We have a built-in rounding. And so we tend to we will ignore zeros for significant digits. So there is only one significant digit, which means if there's only one significant digit, what is the best you can specify your answer to? 1. If you give me pi to one significant different digit, what is it? Pi to one significant digit? 3. It's actually correct, isn't it? If you want to be strictly scientific about it, so here you find, and you will go, if you Google this, you'll find places online would argue that, this verse is in error because it gives you the incorrect, type, Google the Bible in pi, and you'll probably find some sites that'll tell you how this is an error. But it's only because they're only being somewhat scientific. They're being just scientific enough to be able to show an error, but they don't want to get too scientific, because if they get too scientific, then you have to bring in this whole concept of significant digits, and once you do, you come back to, oh, the Bible's actually correct.
My Bible explains it as the diameter is measured outside rim to outside rim, and circumference is done as inside rim. Because
you start getting
verse 26 references another 6 inches.
Yeah, you start getting into little details like that too. But if you say this verse by itself, yeah. So there's no reason there's clearly no reason for an error. And again, think about the concept of rounding in our life. Think about what kind of precision do we live our daily life in. And then think about God communicating His message as opposed to scientific accuracy. And you'll see that the Bible, if taken as intended, was the Bible a math class? When you were taking, introductory math and they're introducing you to the concept of pi, even if you were in a biblical school, are they going to take you to 1 Kings to learn the definition of pi? No, because is it telling you about the definition of pi? No. It's telling you about this bowl that they put outside the temple.
Was the cubit a very precise, always had to be exactly that long, or was it kind of, about, it wasn't...
Yeah, it was always exactly about somewhere in there.
I should explain that.
Yeah, no, there's variations, and the cubit is not exactly a strict measurement, so it varied quite a bit. Okay. So, one other factor to consider here is when the Bible makes a statement, if we take it like the sunrise, we have to take that hyper literally to come up with an error. Is the Bible always meant to be taken strictly literally? Let's take a look at another verse. Take a look at Matthew 18. Matthew 18, verse 21 and 22. This is where Peter comes to Jesus and asks about forgiveness. In fact, let me start, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Is Jesus saying that when you get to 78, no need to forgive anymore? You met your 77 quota limit. And once you get to 78, you're free to ignore them.
King James says 70 times 7.
Okay, but even if we take 70 times 7.
490.
So 491, you're free to say nope. Either way you can translate that. Are you free to forgive somebody and not forgive somebody once you reach your numerical goal? No. This verse is not meant to be taken that literally. This verse is literally saying there's no end to how much we should forgive somebody. If Peter had come up and said, am I to forgive them 8 times? Jesus would have probably said 8 times 8. Or 88 times. So again, the Bible here is not meant to be taken in that strictly literal fashion. And you can see how Jesus is using a rhetorical device. He's coming from the number that Peter gave him, and he's multiplying it, depending on how you want to translate it. He's still multiplying it out to be something vastly larger than he had even considered, to express that there's no limit. So we need to take all these various factors into consideration when we begin to factor in what do we mean by science? How does science and the Bible come together? And this is particularly difficult in our 21st century age because we live in an age where scientists are almost the modern priests and science is the modern religion. That the pronouncement of scientists are to be taken as from on high and cannot be questioned. Even though there may likely be a study next week that says something vastly different from the study this week, it's still, this is the study this week, and for this week, this is the truth. And why? Because the scientists said it. And so when we begin to look at how the science and the Bible come together, the first thing we have to look at is what is even science? How do these broad things interact? And as usual, I have a handout. Nope, the other one.
Which other one?
The one that comes before this one.
So what's that?
That's the next one.
What's that letter?
And
Science can't explain miracles either.
no. Well, science cannot explain the miracle, but then scientists would say and do say that they don't exist. Because science explains everything, and if science can't explain it, then obviously it cannot exist. Okay. So, before you read that too much in detail, what is science? Think about that question for a second. What is science?
The study of the earth.
The study of the earth. And we can expand that out to the study of the universe. That's actually a very good example. Because what is science? It's the study of how the universe works. If I take an apple and I drop it, science will tell me exactly how fast it's going to accelerate as it approaches the ground. It'll tell me how far it will be after a certain point of time, and it will tell me exactly how long it will take to reach the ground. Those are questions of science. What's religion? What is the Bible teaching us?
word.
It's God's word, but what is God's word telling us?
His relationship with us.
Yeah. God's word is telling us primarily about his relationship with us, or lack thereof, and why there's a lack thereof, which is sin, and how that can be overcome so that we can renew a relationship with him. So when we look at the handout, we see the first section. What is science? Some definitions. It's a systematic approach to knowledge that involves observation and testing. A study of what happens in the natural world. A study of the natural laws that govern the world. The study of how the natural world works. The search for natural explanations about the world. Can I see a pattern here? Those are all pretty legitimate things of science. What's religion, at least in terms of a Christian view of religion? Concerns our relationship to God. How are we saved? How should we live? How should we treat one another? It's a foundation for morality. It's a preparation for eternity. So, when we start looking at science and religion, the first thing we see, those are really two vastly different things. So the question is how do they interrelate? And there are four views that are on the diagram. You see the first one, these are called Venn diagrams, by the way. So you see the first diagram, you have science is completely inside of religion. And it's the view that religion is the only source of truth, and science is only true when it agrees with what the Bible teaches. And there are Christians who hold this view. You go to the other side of the spectrum, you've got science, and you don't see religion there. And that's because science is the only source of truth. Religion is false. And this is a very popular view among atheists. It does, however, have a problem. If science is the only source of truth, is that a true statement? And if so, how would we know it?
Testing.
Can science show that science is the only source of truth? Let's put it in a slightly different realm. What if I say the Bible is the only source of truth? How do I know that? Because the Bible tells me that. What's wrong with that?
The Bible.
It's circular. What if I say the Koran is the only source of truth because the Koran tells me that? Or the Book of Mormon is the only source of truth because the Book of Mormon tells me that? Although the Book of Mormon does acknowledge the Bible, so the Book of Mormon doesn't really acknowledge that, say that, but let's assume for sake of argument it did. It's circular. It would be like saying, I'm the only source of truth. Why should you believe me? Because I said so. So now come back. How can science be the only source of truth? For science to be the only source of truth, science would have to tell you that. That would be circular reasoning. And in fact, the statement, science is the only source of truth, is not a scientific statement. It's a philosophical statement. So, view 2, which is one commonly held by a lot of atheists, is actually not even correct. Can't be. It's irrational. So that takes you to the third view, where you have science and religion as two completely separate circles. They're two completely separate sources of truth, and they do not overlap. So science is free to say whatever science wants, and religion is free to say whatever religion wants, and never the twain shall meet, because they're dealing with such different subject areas. Science has nothing to say about our relationship with God. And the Bible has nothing to say about how fast an apple will drop to the ground when dropped. They're two completely different areas. Which is largely true, except it's not quite completely true. There are places where science and religion, in particular the Bible, begin to overlap a bit, or at least appear to overlap. Which brings us to the last one, which science and religion are mostly independent sources of truth, but they overlap in a few areas. Such as the origin of the earth. Such as archaeology, which we looked at last week. That happens to be the view I hold. If you hold one of the others, that's fine. Right? One of the rules of this class, remember, is feel free to disagree with the instructor at any time. I'm not here to get you to agree with me. I'm here to get you to wrestle with the Word of God. But I happen to believe the fourth one, that science is largely independent from what the Bible teaches. Science has nothing to say about how I should treat my neighbor. In fact, I think science should stay completely out of that. Because at one point, science did try to get into that area. They tried to derive morality from those laws of nature. And they looked out into nature, and they saw, well, this is how nature works, therefore, this is how we should work. And since nature was governed by evolution and survival of the fittest, they decided, this group of people decided that our morality should be centered around survival of the fittest. And that ultimately ended up going through a number of different people until it reached its zenith in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. Because Hitler believed that the Jews and the Gypsies and other groups of undesirables, as he would refer to them, actually he referred to them as a lot worse, but that they should be excluded from the gene pool because they were contaminating the gene pool, and that we needed a master race, an Aryan race. Well, that didn't work out very well. And since World War II, there hasn't been a lot of effort to saying we should look to nature to see how we should form our morality. So I think I'm quite content to leave how an apple falls to science and to leave how we should treat one another to the Bible. So it still leaves us with the question of, is the Bible accurate? And of course, the biggest area of overlap is in Genesis. Probably the second biggest area of overlap we've already covered. After that, there's not a lot of science in the Bible. It just doesn't deal with that subject. But it does deal with it in Genesis 1. And there are claims that Genesis 1 conflicts with science. Well, first off, what was Genesis 1 written for? Whenever we start dealing with a question about science in the Bible, the first thing we should ask is, what is the purpose of God's Word at this point? Why is it there? Why was Genesis 1 written? Was it written to tell us how God created the heavens and the earth? Does it even do that? This is where we get to the next handout. This is a translation of Genesis 1:3 from the CSAV. I'm sure you're all familiar with the CSAV, otherwise known as the Current Scientifically Accurate Version. And you probably know the verse a little bit by the more mundane translations of, let there be light. What you have there are the mathematical equations, they're called Maxwell's laws, for light. So if you want to describe the electromagnetic spectrum, if you want to put light into a scientifically accurate form, there's Gauss's laws, the first one, Gauss's law for magnetism, the second one, Maxwell-Faraday's equation, or the law of induction, and Ampere's circuit law with Maxwell's correction. And I'm sure that helped a lot, didn't it? And it's called the currently scientific accurate version because, well, what if they find something out and these equations get tweaked a bit? Which, by the way, they actually have, since I put this together the first time, they actually have gone back through and they've now linked in the weak nuclear force into these laws. So, there probably is already a minor correction to this. Now, could God have given us these laws in Genesis 1? Well, He certainly knew them. But since these are done in the form of calculus, and we had no notation for calculus yet, they would have, at least you look at them, and if you don't have a background in calculus, you at least recognize them as mathematical formula. But imagine looking at them and you don't even know what an algebra statement is yet, because algebra hadn't really been invented yet. Wouldn't you like to go to school then? No algebra. Right? School day only lasted a couple of hours because there wasn't anything to learn yet after that. But calculus wasn't really known up until the time of Newton. And even once it was developed, there's a conflict over, well, exactly how do we represent this new mathematical system? So even when we look at calculus, we're looking at a set of conventions. There's other ways to express this. This is just the conventions that we use. These are the symbols. Show this to an alien, and they probably wouldn't recognize it either, because they may have a whole different way of approaching it. Once you explain it, then they would know how to map it. Sort of like once we learn German, we can make sense of German. So how would God have even done this to a culture that didn't know algebra, much less calculus? And quite frankly, what leads us to believe that even if He did a complete, accurate description of how He created the universe, that we would even understand it today? Or would we look at it and say, that's gibberish? We don't understand that. And then suddenly we're down on this very long rabbit trail of calculus and integral equations and all this fun stuff. And what's the purpose of Genesis 1? When we come back to the purpose of Genesis 1, this is actually one of my problems with a lot of the creation evolution debate. It's all well and good, but we sometimes get so caught up in the creation evolution debate, we never stop to ask, why is Genesis 1 there in the first place? It is not to tell us how God created the universe. It's there to tell us the order of things and where we fit in. That's what it's there for. And when it's talking about the order of things, it starts off in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God. Probably the most significant words in all of the Bible. In the beginning, God. Everything after that, all the way to Revelations, is an explanation. But that's where you start. And then you go through creation. And what's the pinnacle of creation? He created Adam and Eve. And if you read Genesis 1, and you forget about all the scientific stuff, and you just read it for what it says, it has a very important and profound message. And quite frankly, a message that is key to us today. And as affects our culture on a daily basis. What's the most important creation? We are. Do you think God would approve of putting animals before men? Does that mean we can treat them however we want? No, it doesn't. We're stewards. We're to watch over and care for the world. Doesn't mean we can rape and pillage and destroy it. But it does mean we can use it. And so, for example, down in California for the last 3 or 4 years, they have turned off the water going into the Central Valley. Unemployment is up to 40% in that area. Because of a fish called the Delta smelt. What do we do with smelt here in Wisconsin?
Friday night fish fry.
Friday night fish fry. We eat them. Right? But they have people whose lives are being devastated. Entire counties are being devastated. And that actually ripples throughout the entire. One of the reasons our food prices are going up is because the Central Valley, that's basically one of the primary food sources for the country, has been shut down because of a Delta smelt. Now, I'm all for saving the planet, right? I just happen to put people first. So this is a message that even our culture today needs to hear about. Because all too often, in fact, quite frankly, the EPA laws, the endangered species laws and things like that, there's nothing in there that says they have to take into consideration the impact of their laws on people. They have to care for the animals, but people don't count. And if you look through the newspapers, you can probably fairly easily find instances of people who killed somebody and they got, a couple of years. They kill a dog, boy, you can get in real trouble for doing that. There are people who have been sentenced to prison for a longer time for killing an animal than some people have been sentenced for killing a human. And I think part of the problem is we not only are the scientific community and the atheists ignoring Genesis, but even many of the Christians are ignoring what Genesis says because they're so caught up into, does it match the Bible over here or science, and is old earth, young earth, and all these various evolution versus creation debates, and they're so focused on that that they don't even actually get to what it's actually trying to teach us. In the beginning, God. So as we begin to approach this, how do we approach Genesis 1? And how do we address the issue? And this will take us pretty much where we will pick up on next week. So we're going to take a little side diversion, and we're going to look at the issue of how old is the earth? We don't have time to go through a step-by-step breakdown of Genesis 1. But we will look at one key issue, because this issue drives an awful lot of the debate, which is how old is the earth? Any questions before we quit?
You know, hear of scientists that are atheists, but you also hear of scientists that when they come to the realization that science is not the total answer, then they become Christians.
Yes. Yeah, you do hear of scientists who are atheists, but there are scientists who are Christians. And quite frankly, if you look back in history, most of the major scientists that we think of, the big names, had at least some concept of God. Right? And you actually, if you shameless plug here, if you look at my book on the chapters on science, I actually talk about that issue. I talk about some of the scientists and their views. For example, Kepler. When Kepler discovered his laws of planetary motion, he wrote that, "Oh God, I'm thinking thy thoughts after thee." That rather than being hostile to religion, that actually science grew up out of a Christian worldview. If you think about it, why did science come out of Western Europe, but not out of China? If you remember your history, gunpowder and all this other stuff was found in China long before it was found in Western Europe. In fact, most of that migrated from China and Western Europe. A lot of it migrated out of the Islamic cultures, our knowledge of algebra and stuff. You can blame the Arabs for that. I think it was one of the great contributions of the concept of algebra into our system. That's why we have, for example, the word azimuth. If you remember from your math classes, that's an Arabic word. So our whole concept, the concept of zero, came into Western Europe through Arab culture. But why did it happen differently? When it got into Western culture, why did we do so much more with it? Part of it, quite frankly, is the Christian religion. A religion that viewed God as a rational being. And the idea that God created the heavens and the earth, and just like you would study a painting to learn about the painter, that you could study the universe to learn about God. And so a lot of early science was driven by the concept that God was a rational being who made a rational universe, and that if we could learn about the universe, we could learn about God. And it was only when you get to the middle of the 19th century that you have a lot of philosophical views coming in, and you have the schism develop between science and religion. And quite frankly, religion was guilty. We became very closed-minded. We became very literal in our understanding of how the Bible was. We weren't going for what the Bible says, but not being very, open-minded to new ideas. It's one of the things we saw in 1 John. We never have to be afraid of the truth, because God is truth. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And truth isn't thrown in there just because he couldn't think of a third word to slot into that position. It's there because it's important and it's key.
Science worships the creature and religion worships the creator.
Science worships the creature. Religion worships the creation. There are definitely some scientists who do. But remember, science is like a hammer. It's a tool. And it works fabulously for driving the metaphorical nail. Right? It doesn't work very well if you have a screw. It doesn't work at all if you have a nut. Right? Science is a tool, but science is applied in the areas that science does best. It works wonderful. But just like somebody with a hammer can use it properly, a scientist can use science improperly or properly. Let's go ahead and close, and we will continue this more next week. Nothing to them. So one of the things we have to realize is that when we come to the Bible, it's not a textbook of science. It's communicating the message of God. And it's communicating it in a way that the people who hear it can understand it. And so, yeah, it could be said it's technically an error when it talks about sunrise, because we know from our science classes that the sun doesn't really rise. It only appears to rise. But that's the way the Bible describes things. It's not attempting to set forth a scientific, accurate explanation. And in this case, it's attempting to describe the glory of God. And if you think about this really clear, beautiful morning where the sun's just coming up over the horizon, you've probably all experienced mornings like that, and they sort of take your breath away, and they're just gorgeous. And you just want to stop and take it in for a while. That's what this verse is talking about. It's not talking about celestial mechanics and the movement of the planets around the stars. Let's take a look at another supposed error this time. Go to 1 Kings, chapter 7.
Are these verses that skeptics have pointed to?
I have heard the sunrise. I was actually in another verse, but when I did the research on the other verse, it turns out that one is not really even talking about sunrise, so I moved to this one. This one is an actual error. If you Google this online, you will find skeptics. I've had debates with skeptics over this one, and they are insistent that this is a clear scientific error in the Bible. And we'll talk about the potential error, and we'll talk about why it's actually not an error, if you want to be hyper-scientific about it. So let's take a look at 1 Kings 7:23. He made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. So they're talking about the bowl, the huge bowl that sits outside the temple, right? And we know from the dimensions given here that what was the diameter?
30. Was it 30 cubits around?
Circumference is 30 cubits. Basically, if you work out the math, what do you get for a value of pi? All right. Here we are. The Bible, how we got it, and why we can trust it. And first off, any questions from what we've covered so far? No? All right. Well, we've been going through the Bible. We've pretty much finished how we got it. We went through the transmission of the text, the translations, all that fun stuff. We're now talking about the reliability. We know the Bible we have is what was written by the apostles and prophets, and that has come down to us, and we don't have to worry about all these myths about it being changed or edited or things like that. We know those are false because the evidence shows that they're false. But that still leaves the question of, we may have what they wrote, but is what they wrote true? Is it accurate? And so we've been looking at the reliability, and the first part of that was the internal reliability. And now we're looking at the external reliability. And last time we looked at archaeology, and we showed that why we can't prove the Bible, we can't expect to find a bill of sale for Joseph, that the details described in the Bible line up very, very well, and in fact line up in a way that shows that the critics of the Bible are false. They would require them to know conditions 1,000 years before they were writing, when even we didn't know that until we did the detailed archaeological work. So, but this week we're going to start going into a little bit more broader topic of science in the Bible. And how do we correspond our 21st century understanding of science with a document written thousands of years ago, before we knew about Newton's laws or Kepler's laws of planetary motion or gravity or any of the things, or Einstein or quantum mechanics? How do we reconcile those two? And like we saw in archaeology, a large part of it's going to be, how do you approach the subject? What kind of questions do you ask? So, first off, are there clear scientific errors in the Bible? Well, if you want to be strictly literal, yes, there are. Take a look at 2 Samuel 23:4. 2 Samuel 23:4, talking about God. He is the light of the morning at sunrise, on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings the grass from the earth. Well, we know the sun doesn't actually rise, right? We know the earth is actually spinning on its axis. So is this an error in the Bible? Well, if you want to be really hyper-technical, yes it is. But on the other hand, do we still speak of sunrise?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, we do. Is the morning news, when it says sunrise will be at 6:23, in error? Well, if you want to be strictly scientifically literal, yes. But on the other hand, we all know what it means. It means the time the sun comes up. Now, it would have been possible, through the inspiration of God, for the author of Samuel to write something along the lines of, he is like the morning, he's like the light of the morning at the time that the movement of the sun rises above the horizon due to the rotation of the earth. But would that have really made any sense? And in fact, what would it have actually meant to someone reading Samuel in the time it was written?
Absolutely nothing.
Or 500 years, or 1,000 years after that, or at the time of Jesus, or in the Middle Ages? It would have meant